Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 38 in the ongoing series. I've taken an extra day because this is quite a challenging episode. In fact, the last dozen or so episodes in the series are all pretty challenging. What I'm going to be doing in this episode is trying to focus basically just on the garrote. And we're also going to be addressing another issue associated with the garrote, which is, was it whittled? And what does that mean? What does that imply? What inferences can we draw from that? And so to kind of kick off the whole discussion, we can go to Patsy Ramsey's interrogation with Steve Thomas and Tom Trujillo. That's someone corrected my pronunciation. On the 30th of April 1997. And so Steve Thomas asked Patsy, once we were told that Burke at times would walk through the house whittling, and that was something that apparently got on Linda Hoffman's nerves somehow to clean up after him, and Patsy answers right. So Patsy confirms that this is true. She doesn't argue with him. Steve Thomas says, was this consistent with his little pocket knife? In other words, so was Burke whittling with his knife? Patsy responds, yeah. Steve Thomas continues. He says, he'd walk through the house whittling, and for the tape, I'm showing Patsy a photo of a little red Swiss Army knife. Patsy responds, right. He had one we had gotten him in Switzerland. It had his name on it. Does this have his name on it? Steve Thomas answers, I don't know. And Patsy says, you don't know. Okay. So you can draw some inferences from that already and say, well, how many knives were there? How many red Swiss Army knives were there? How many knives had Burke's name on it? And that is something we're not going to deal with in this episode because I want to keep it just on the subject of the garrote. Now, in your mind, you might want to just sort of psychologically close your eyes and isolate what we're talking about here. So when we talk about the garrote, we're talking about that wooden piece of the paintbrush that was broken off. That's actually the main topic of what we're going to be talking about here. But obviously also connected to this cord, and there's a particular knot that is around the stick, and then the nylon string terminates in a kind of a noose or a loop, right? That's all I really want you to keep in your mind. So I want you to think of this almost T-shaped stick, T-shaped in the sense of the stick and the string, and then the bottom of it in a kind of a, how can I put it, like a loop. So it's almost the symbol for female upside down. So I just want you to visualize a circle with a short length connecting the circle to this junction, and unlike the female sign, there's no protrusion on the other end, and obviously it's also inverted. If you want to think of it that way, it doesn't really matter whether it's upside, downside, sideways, the one way or the other. But that is what I want you just to think about in your mind. And we're gonna make another comparison at the end of this episode to what this really is. And the argument that I'm actually trying to make is that this isn't a garrote, right? The fact that it was used as a garrote, the fact that it executed like a garrote, doesn't mean that it was intended to be a garrote or that it was made to be a garrote. Does that make sense? So in other words, I don't think that this little device was created for the purpose that it ultimately served, okay? The other thing that I want you to think about is that by naming it a garrote, you are creating a kind of a cognitive bias. In other words, you're giving it a name and a sort of an identity, which is just automatically making you think about some kind of hardcore adult intruder predator, right? And I think if you take away that garrote name, the garrote label, you just take it away and you say, well, what are we dealing with here? Well, it's a stick with a piece of string with a loop around it. What else could it be, right? And so what I want you to just put into your mind is consider the possibility that what this thing isn't a garrote. I know that it's been called a garrote for 25 years, but this case hasn't been solved for 25 years. So we've got to redesign our thinking. We've got to rewire our thinking. We've got to change the way we think about things and the names that we give things that we've given for 25 years. Do you agree? And you're going to see how this makes sense as we go through it. So I'm going to come into this topic from the side. I'm not going to take it on head on. I'm going to take it on from the side, and by saying that, I mean we're going to deal with Burke's habit of whittling and what that means. Okay, but before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, please use the hashtag TCRS. And let's get started. So, like I said, I want to get into I want to come into the subject talking about whittling, the idea of whittling, right? And that is definitely not in dispute. We know that the housekeeper, it was such a regular thing. In fact, Burke was in the habit of doing it so often that it actually annoyed the housekeeper to the extent that she confiscated his knife, and we'll get to that in an article. It's also something that Patsy doesn't argue. She doesn't challenge. She admits it and she accepts it. And what is quite interesting is when she admits this and accepts it, she says very little. She says right, then she says yeah. She doesn't elaborate, and if anything, she just says, well, it's something that we got in another country. And she also kind of undermines Steve Thomas by saying, well, the knife you're talking about, does it have Burke's name on it? Which is kind of implying if it doesn't have his name on it, it's not his. Maybe it's somebody else's. But I mean, if you can't really say that if something doesn't have your name on it, that it's not necessarily yours, or it's not yours. Do you get what I'm saying? It is interesting just how very little Patsy contributes to this area of the conversation. Now, before we actually physically look at the stick, I want us to go through two articles that appeared in 1999, the one on August the 3rd, 1999, in the Boulder Daily Camera, and the other, I think it was the day before that, in the Denver Rocky Mountain News on August the 2nd. And that article was titled Red Knife, a Ramsey Mystery. Although they were chronologically in a different order, in other words, the Rocky Mountain News came out first, just for the reasons of this episode, I'm going to do them out of order. I'm going to do the Boulder Daily Camera one, even though it came out afterwards, I'm going to do it first, okay? And there's a reason why I want to do that. The reason is really just the Associated Press article kind of glosses over a few little details that the other article doesn't. So I want to start off with the less detailed article and then go into the more detailed article. And so it really just starts off saying that there's a former housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, that worked for John Bonet's parents, and she believed that the location of the knife found by police cast doubt on the intruder theory, right? And you don't need to agree with her. That's not really the point of this episode. The point of this episode is to get to the crux of this whole business of whittling, right? And to try and understand what that funny contraption is that we're talking about. Who made it? Why was it made? What was it made for? And all that kind of thing. So in the next paragraph, Linda Hoffman Pugh talks about a knife that she hid in a cupboard on the second level of the home, and it was found by police in the basement where John Bonet's body was discovered. Now, I'm the first person to acknowledge that that's not very clear. If you say the knife was found where John Bonet's body was discovered, does that mean in the basement? Does it mean right next to her body? Does it mean in the same room? Does it mean a little bit further away? What does it mean? So I understand that. And this is a definite area of confusion, and I've been attacked for trying to mislead people to say, there wasn't a knife right next to John Bonet's body. What I can say is that there is you could either say contradictory information, or there may be two knives. So either it's a knife was moved from one position to another, and it's the same knife, or it's contradictory information. Or the other possibility is that there were two knives, that there was one knife in the wine cellar and another knife somewhere else. And it's just the nature of this case that some things are not clarified and they're not very well expressed. But I don't appreciate being accused of trying to mislead people. I'm simply saying that this is how it appears, right? So this article is simply saying that a knife was found near John Bonet's body, and the housekeeper found this quite suspicious because she knew where she placed the knife. And so she's thinking, how on earth would an intruder know to find that knife? I mean, why would he go through linen cupboards, with all the other things he had to do, with the ransom note that he had to write and all that kind of thing. The other thing you could legitimately argue is, why the F wouldn't an intruder bring his own effing knife along? I mean, didn't this intruder bring anything along to this crime scene? Nothing. So anyway, it's her opinion, the housekeeper, who says there's a quote from Linda Hoffman Pugh. She says, that knife showed up where John Bonet was. She says, I would stake my life that an intruder wouldn't know to get that out of the cupboard. Someone took that knife out of the cupboard where I put it, end quote. And I think that she assumes that someone was Patsy, and it could be Patsy, and we're going to get to that, whether Patsy did take the knife out the cupboard and give it to Burke, or it's possible, I guess, that Burke found the knife. But the point is that this is Hoffman Pugh's position, is that there's no way an intruder would have found that knife. And you could disagree with it. You could say, well, maybe he did, right? This is just her position. The interesting thing is the article refers to a detective. I'm guessing it's Steve Thomas, because Steve Thomas brought this up directly with Patsy, and obviously Linda Hoffman Pugh and Steve Thomas spoke a lot with one another. It sounds like that. And but he's not named in this article, but he's saying that Linda Hoffman Pugh's theory has merit. In other words, this thing about the knife has merit. Her supposition that an intruder wouldn't have known to look for this knife in the cupboard has merit. The possibility that someone familiar with what was in the house would be more likely to know the knife was there, in his opinion, has merit. So what he says is, and this is a quote to the Denver Rocky Mountain News. So this is obviously recycling the article from the day before. And so the unnamed detective is quoted saying, quote, I think it's a legitimate area of concern that she, meaning Linda Hoffman Pugh, has pointed out. Then it goes on to say, Linda Hoffman Pugh doesn't know who killed John Bonet, but then goes on to say, John Bonet's brother Burke, who was 9 when his sister was killed, used to wander around the house whittling with his Swiss Army knife and leave wood shavings behind. She said she threatened to take the knife away from Burke unless he cleaned up his act, and then he didn't. And about a month before John Bonet's death, Lindehoff and Pugh took away the knife and put it in a cupboard over a sink near John Bonet's room. Now, there's so much you can get out of that. One of the primary things you get out of that is just 1 month before John Bonet died, Burke was whittling regularly. He was habitually whittling, and he was whittling to such an excessive rate or an amount that the housekeeper got so aggravated that she confiscated it. So this is a very important timestamp. It's giving us an idea what is going on with Burke going into December. Does that make sense? The other thing is, and this is besides just the knife, and we're going to deal with the knife in a separate episode, because this episode's not about knives, it's actually about the wood that you find on that funny little instrument. And so what can you do with wood? Well, you whittle wood. And so the question is that particular stick whittled? That's the question. Now, what we have here is first-hand account, essentially, saying that Burke was wandering around the house whittling. So it was something that he was doing for fun. She doesn't say why. She doesn't say what he was doing. Unfortunately, those details aren't there. But there were wood shavings left behind. Now, with certain things, so certain objects, you're going to get wood shavings. And with other objects, you might get fragments or little pieces if it's something small. And I'll give an example. If you had to whittle, for example, a pencil, I would wager that, because it's a small thing, that your whittling is going to look like little fragments because you don't have much to work with. Whereas if you're whittling something like a branch, quite a big branch, then you're going to have sort of flakes that sort of curve and curl. Does that make sense? It's almost, if you compare, although it's not the right word, if you are taking the skin off an apple, you've got more to work with than if it's trying to, say, break open an acorn. The one is going to leave curly sort of fragments, and the other is going to leave small, not fragments, it's going to leave shavings, I guess is the word. Another one's going to leave much smaller kind of fragments because you've got less to work with, okay? So the other thing that is really interesting is that the housekeeper says she didn't tell John Bonet's parents where she put the knife. So I don't know what she's trying to say through that, but it sounds like, and I'm making an assumption here, but it sounds like she's suggesting that Burke knew that his knife was confiscated and perhaps he searched for it, and perhaps Burke was the one who retrieved the knife, right? Now we know that Burke himself refers to a knife in the interview that he gave just 2 weeks after John Bonet's death. And I think this article comes from the denverpreps.com. I'm quoting it from a forum, but it just refers to the cops getting their first inkling of suspicion came in the morning after John Bonet's body was found in the basement, when Burke was taken to a friend's house without asking a single question about why all the police were in his house or where his sister was. But then under that it refers to 2 weeks later, Burke shocked a police psychologist by shouting, "I know what happened. She was killed. Someone took her quietly and took her down in the basement, took a knife out and then hit her on the head." And there's somewhere in that description, there's somewhere in that dramatization, that role-playing, where Burke says something like, "Whoops," almost that something happened that surprised even him, right? Then he says, at that point, or it's written in this Denver Preps, I think this article has been removed online, but I'm not actually sure if that is from Denver Preps. I'm quoting this from a forum, from Web Sleuths. I think it's actually from another forum, actually. It's just difficult to make out what it is. But they are saying that only the police knew that Burke's Swiss Army knife had been found next to John Bonet's body. And then there's a casual remark, "I wouldn't call down the hall near a sink next to John Bonet's body." And there you already have this sense of confusion, why is one person saying the knife was right next to her body, another one saying, well, it was down the hall near a sink? So, in other words, in the basement but further away. So already you have this confusion, and a lot of people stop there. And what they don't do is they don't go further and try and find out, okay, what are the circumstances around this one knife? What are the circumstances around the other? Can they be sort of told apart? And as I've said, this episode isn't about knives. It's about whittling and about wood. Some criticism I've gotten on this whole subject is, someone has sort of attacked me. I won't say where, but just sort of really tried to ridicule my comments on this and said, what kind of idiotic intruder would murder John Bonet and then take the time to sort of whittle a garrote, something like that? That's the argument. And just a stupid way of arguing, because there's another alternative, and the other alternative is that this piece of wood was whittled or created or snapped or whatever you want to say long before. When I say long before, it could have happened a few days before, hours before, weeks before, whatever. And that is why I'm saying, don't think of this as a garrote, think of it as something else. And that's why I also say, I don't think this device was made specifically with John Bonet in mind. And I also don't think it was made with murdering John Bonet in mind. Does that make sense? Now, again, as soon as you go down that route, you kind of need more information. You need to say, well, what was it made for? And we will deal with that again in a separate episode. We first just want to establish what are we looking at here. And that is why we're now going to look at we're going to look at this piece of wood and see what we see. Before we get to that, and also before we get to the that second article, I just want to jump into another interview. And once again, Tom Haney asked the appropriate question, and this was in the June 1998 interview with Patsy. He refers back to this original point, which just shows you how important it is. It was so important that he brought it up again. So Tom Haney says, in the previous interview on the last April, there was some discussion about Burke having a Swiss Army knife, and I think at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, you said it had his name or initials on it. Patsy Ramsey answers right. That's all she says. She doesn't elaborate. She doesn't give details. She's not really helping the guy with information. Tom Haney goes on, would he have had any other knives, or would there have been any other Swiss Army type of knives in the house? Did John have any? So what the officers are kind of asking here is, they are under the impression that there wasn't just one knife. There wasn't just one Swiss Army knife, or was there more than just one Swiss Army knife? In other words, we have this idea that a knife was found in the wine cellar and another knife was found further down the corridor, or was the knife in the wine cellar was the knife in the wine cellar moved, right? The interesting thing with, and I could be wrong on this, when John Ramsey talks about finding John Bonet, he never mentions a knife. I don't know whether Fleet mentioned it, but it doesn't sort of ring a bell, and I could be wrong because I don't have that material in front of me. But I think there is the possibility that somebody moved the knife that was originally in the wine cellar to further away, and who would do that, and why would anyone do that? Again, there's also the possibility that there are two separate knives, one with Burke's initials on it and another without, and they're both sort of Swiss Army knives, okay? One way of confirming that is just to go through the evidence list and to see how many knives were there. As I said, this episode isn't about knives, so we will deal with that in an episode about knives. Anyway, just to go back to the interview, Patsy says, I don't know, I don't remember. Then Tom Haney says, would Burke have had more than just one with his name on it? And then Patsy makes this sort of obscure remark where she says, it seems like we might have had a little tiny one, like a keychain or something. And she says, I just remember the red one with his name that I got in Switzerland. So she's sort of admitting that there may have been another one, but you do get those very small Swiss Army knives that come on a keychain. So she seems to be acknowledging that there was a second knife, but it was very small. Okay. And now I want to go to the article from the Denver Rocky Mountain News. It actually came out before the Boulder Daily Camera article, and the title is Red Knife, a Mystery. The title of the other one is Ramsey Housekeeper Doubts Intruder Theory, Pocket Knife Hidden in Cupboard Found Near John Bonet's Body, right? So it starts off saying, housekeeper who hid tool wonders how it reappeared and doubts the intruder theory. And this was written by Charlie Brennan. And then it just talks about the former housekeeper doubting the intruder theory and saying one big reason is a little red knife. Quite clever use of language here. Then it refers to just giving some broad backstory. Linda Hoffman-Pugh working for the Ramseys in their home for more than a year, and saying that she doesn't know who killed John Bonet, but she doubts that a stranger broke in, doubt that the stranger snatched John Bonet from her bed, beat her, strangled her with a garrote, then left her bound with a white cord. And then it goes on saying, central to her skepticism is the mystery around this knife. Then there's this reference to it being a legitimate area of concern by the anonymous detective, the same thing in the Associated Press recycling of the article. Then it refers to John Bonet's brother Burke, 9 at the time, was in the habit of wandering around the family's home whittling with his Swiss Army knife. Now, the reason that I've specifically come to this article is just to emphasize really those words, that he was in the habit of wandering around the house whittling. And if you just abbreviate that sentence, it just basically means that Burke was in the habit of whittling, right? Burke was in the habit of taking a knife and cutting pieces of wood all the time. That's the thing that is being told here. If you just take that on its own, you can take the whittling part out of it. Just that Burke was in the habit of playing with pieces of wood with a knife. And now you have a situation where there's a paintbrush, and what's gone on with the paintbrush? Well, the paintbrush has been fashioned. And some people described it as someone had fashioned a garrote. Again, I wouldn't take it that far, but what is acknowledged, what I think everyone would agree on, is that this wood has been fashioned, it's been shaped, it's been changed, it's been transformed from one thing, a paintbrush, into something else. Do you agree with that? And so what are we talking about? Well, the two ends of it were snapped off, and so the shape of this wooden tool has been transformed. Now you can say no whittling took place. I think it's arguing over semantics, but that's just one side of the equation. The point is that this piece of wood was being fashioned, and now we can also see that Burke was someone who was doing this right up until the time that John Bonet died, right up until Christmas. And in this particular article it says, quote, he'd trail shavings behind him so often that Hoffman-Pugh warned she'd take away the knife if it didn't become more tidy. And then he didn't. About a month before John Bonet's murder, Hoffman-Pugh made good on her threat, and she said, I got tired of cleaning it up. And I remember in a previous episode I mentioned that that the housekeeper had said something about the children weren't very responsible, and someone said, wow, that's just such an unfair comment to make. For goodness sake, the one child's 6 years old and the other one is 9. But here's a good example of what she's talking about. There's this little boy who walks around the house whittling and leaving behind these flakes, and this housekeeper's got to pick it up. And he doesn't just do it once, he's always doing it. And so a responsible boy would have done it outside, or would have done it in a way that he could pick up after himself. And then he didn't. In other words, he didn't listen to what he's being told not to do. He was, I guess, being naughty. And so she says he'd been asked to do it over paper or a bag or something. And so she says, I just put the knife up I picked the knife up one day, put it in a cupboard over the sink in that area outside of John Bonet's room on the home second level. And that area also had a microwave and laundry facilities. So we can actually imagine that during that month, just imagine, and I could be wrong, we could be imagining things totally wrong, but imagine that Burke was searching for this knife that had been confiscated, and he's searching all over the house, including John Bonet's room and the area around John Bonet's room. The fact that the housekeeper had put the knife on the outside of John Bonet's room and it had then moved suggests that Burke may have found it, and the only way he could have found it was if he was lingering in the area, searching in the area. Does that make sense? Anyway, Hoffman-Pugh says she never saw the knife again, but then it did resurface. And then it talks about the exhaustive inventory of items removed from the house following the 10-day search, including red pocket knife with broken ornament. And that's from the family's basement. I don't know what the broken ornament refers to. We don't know whether this broken ornament was made out of wood or whether it was whittled as well. We just don't know. Then it refers to Detective Kerry Yamaguchi discovering Burke's knife on a countertop near a sink just down a basement corridor from the small basement room where John Bonet's body is found. So that is giving us clear information about that knife. Does that make sense? Anyway, Linda Hoffman-Pugh wanted to know, how did the knife get there? So just a final thing that I want to bring your attention to is a traditional garrote. The thing that most of us know to be a garrote is something that has a handhold or something to grasp on two ends, right? It is a piece of cord or wire that has a grip on both ends. And as far as I know, most of them don't have a loop on them. It's just simply a cord, and it is used then, we know what it's used for. And that is why I don't think this is a garrote. It's something else. Okay? That's the first thing I want to emphasize. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is a conventional paintbrush that is just broken on either end, like the stick in the Ramsey example, and then you can see obviously at face value how they're different. And how they are different is, well, first of all, virtually all of the original paint no longer appears on the stick, right, on the stick below. And there could be two reasons for it. The one reason is it could have been sandpapered off. The other reason is that it could be a very old paintbrush, in the sense that this paint has come off by itself. There's also a third possibility, which is that it was naturally that color, that it didn't have some kind of paint on it or varnish on it in the first place. Okay? I think that's definitely a possibility. But the thing that I don't think you can escape is the irregular surface of the stick used as an implement. And if we're not going to call it a garrote, then we need to call it something. And I think we will try and come up with a name for this thing that's not a garrote in the next episode. I think I'm not going to take it further than that. We've been talking about this for 33 minutes for the YouTube crowd. So if you want to get the rest of this episode, head on to patreon.com/TCRS, where we're going to zoom in on this piece of wood and really examine it and see what we think. Does it look like it's been whittled? Does it look like there are any irregularities? And we're going to look at it from different angles and also from different crime scene photos, giving different perspectives of it. So if you want to check that out, head on to Patreon, and otherwise I'll see you guys next time. So if we're examining the characteristics of the stick,